Welcome to the 71st Produce Safety Group Educators Call, and this is also including the trainers. Today we're talking about the pre-harvest agricultural water requirements and specifically the revisions to PSA Grower Training Manual, the revised Module 5.1. Just like all the educators calls, participants are muted. There will be time for questions and discussion at the end of the meeting. Feel free to use the chat box. If somebody could just test the chat box, I'm always paranoid that that one of the participants that the chat box isn't working. So if somebody could just say hello in the chat box, that would help us know whether I set it up appropriately. It looks like it is disabled. That's too bad. Betsy,
Uh,
you're
we
the
have,
co.
okay, I'll go in and see if I can deal with it. We
Okay.
also have people raising their hands, and I'm guessing this is why they're raising their hand, is to
Yes, that
tell
would be
us
my
that
guess.
it does not work. Okay.
Thank you for letting us know that the chat box is currently disabled. We'll do what we can to get that set up. We are recording. The presentation will be shared via the listserv and on the website after the call. So our agenda for today is to just do a brief recap of the Subpart E revisions. Many of you will have already read them. And then we're going to do a train the trainer style presentation of revised Module 5.1 as part of the PSA Grower Training Course. We'll talk a little bit. Betsy will then come on and talk about the policies and expectations about how to transition into revised Module 5.1 as a way to get the most current and appropriate material to our trainees. And then we'll just have a discussion about how things are going and how we want to see things go. Our key goals are to share updates on PSA Grower Training Course Module 5.1. Again, this is an educator's call and a PSA trainer's call all wrapped into one. We will edit the train the trainer portion of the call for use as a training video. Many of you know that under trainer resources on the PSA website, each module has a train the trainer refresher office hours. So we'll use this recording edited to replace the train the trainer office hours from module 5.1 version 1.2 that was recorded back in 2020. So just a brief overview of what has happened with Subpart E. The rule to revise FSMA Produce Safety Rule Subpart E came out May 6th of 2024, so just about a month ago. In addition to the pre-harvest water uses, some other things also changed. Excellent. I'm glad chat's working. In addition to those pre-harvest water uses, Subpart A gained two definitions. There's a requirement in Subpart B that changed. Some of the records requirements changed to reflect new provision numbers. The post-harvest water and sprout water requirements in Subpart E did not change in any substantial way, but their provision numbers did change. And also Subpart N, the one about microbial methods, changed. Again, there were no changes to the actual requirements for sprouts or for agricultural water used during harvest and post-harvest, but the provision numbers and some of the exact language did change. We want to inform everybody or remind people that the revised Module 5.1 is a stopgap measure. We wanted to work as quickly as we could to address the information that was in the current Module 5.1 because it's no longer accurate to what the requirements of the produce safety rules say. Ultimately, we would love to do a full revision for the produce safety training manual version 2.0. That's going to take some time and resources, and we don't have a timeline for actually accomplishing that yet. So as a reminder, those of you who are trained or who have done training on pre-harvest rules that were published in 2015, the focus was on creating a microbial water quality profile of generic E. coli data. One thing that a really key thing for you to know now is that the MWQP is no longer a focus of delivering Module 5.1. In most cases, testing isn't a requirement in pre-harvest water. So it's very important that previously trained participants understand the shift and know that PSA is working on update slides so that we can all work together to share information with previously trained growers. Those update slides aren't done yet, and we don't have a timeline. We just want you to know that it is on our minds, and we do very much want to do that. The grower training courses, in the meantime, should emphasize testing as a tool and an option, but not as a general requirement. So here's a little bit, just an overview of what those pre-harvest testing, the pre-harvest water quality requirements are in the Subpart E. The one thing that has not changed is the requirement to do an agricultural water systems inspection. That applies to all agricultural water, both pre-harvest and post-harvest. That number was 11242 in the original. It's still 11242 in the revised Subpart E. In addition to that, those who are using pre-harvest agricultural water now have to do an agricultural water assessment. The number for that new requirement is 11243. 11243 used to be sanitizer. It used to be testing or treating the water. Now it's an agricultural water assessment. Components of that agricultural water assessment, they call them 5 elements. And the first one is, what are the characteristics of the agricultural water system? One thing to know is that the agricultural water systems inspection collects almost all the information you need to incorporate agricultural water systems characteristics into the agricultural water assessment. In addition to information about the systems, information about water use practices, crop characteristics, environmental conditions, and other relevant factors. And the one relevant factor that that has been discussed is testing as a potential input, and we'll talk about that later. All those 5 elements of an agricultural water assessment are put together to develop an outcome. Based on that outcome, measures and timing of implementing those measures are expected of a produce grower in order to reduce risks. So let's talk about those 4 outcomes that can come out of an agricultural water assessment. The first one is, and this is the one everybody wants to see, no measures are needed. If a grower does their ag water assessment with those 5 elements and they say there are no conditions that cause me to take measures to reduce risk to produce safety because of the water quality, well, then no measures are needed. The grower only needs to document that decision so they can discuss it if there is an inspection or if anyone else asks, and then reassess as needed, generally speaking, a year later or when something changes. We'll talk about that when we get into the module. A second outcome might be that measures are needed to reduce risk because of water quality, and the conditions that pose a risk to water quality involve animal activities, soil amendments, or human waste, and this is important, if they're on nearby or adjacent lands. If that's the case, then the grower must promptly implement mitigation measures and write that into their agricultural water assessment as the outcome of their ag water assessment. They will do something called a mitigation measure in order to reduce risk to produce safety. On a related note, the outcome of the agricultural water assessment could be that measures are needed to reduce risk, but those measures are not related to animal activities, soil amendments, or human waste, or those measures are not on adjacent or nearby lands. In other words, they are on the actual land of the farm. If that's the case, then as soon as practicable, and I'm sorry, I forgot to say promptly in the other one. So this one is quickly, the darker orange is promptly. The lighter yellow is as soon as practicable, no later than the following year. Implement some of those same mitigation measures in order to reduce risk. In this case, a grower may also opt to include testing as one of the other relevant factors in their agricultural water assessment. In other words, if they're not sure whether the conditions are severe enough to warrant mitigation measures, testing can be brought in as another piece of information to help evaluate whether or not mitigation measures are needed. And then the final outcome, the 4th outcome, is that measures are needed because to manage risk because that water is not safe and it's not of adequate sanitary quality for the intended use. If that's the case, then immediately discontinue use and implement corrective measures. So those are called corrective measures as opposed to mitigation measures. We decided together that we wanted to give you that general broad outline of what the requirements in revised Subpart E were so that we all have that in our minds before we get into, well, how do we teach this? We wanted to just give the overview of what's in it. And in a minute here, we'll start talking about how do we actually teach that and train that as part of a grower training course. Because the provision numbers changed, I want to point out to you that there's a reference table Many of us are used to just saying, well, that's in 112.43, that's in 112.47, that one's part of 112.44, or maybe it's just me. I don't know. But what I wanted to point out to you, just to make sure that you know where it is that within the codified, or I'm sorry, within the preamble, there's this table, and it's also it's also on the web page. The first column is what was the provision in 2015. The second column is what changes were made in 2024. And then the third column is what's the location of the provision in the final rule. So you can use that as a handy dandy cross-reference. So how does this change what we do in the PSA Grower Training Course? In the short term, as soon as as this was published, we learned about it on the 2nd of May, and it was published on the 6th of May. We sent an email to all trainers to let them know that we still have to continue giving growers some information about managing pre-harvest water quality. At the time, your only option was really to continue using Module 5.1 from the existing manuals, and we strongly recommended that you use the supplemental slides that dealt with the proposed agricultural Subpart E revisions. That's because the proposed revisions were very similar to the actual provisions, the actual revision that got published a couple of weeks ago. That was the recommendation on May 3rd because we didn't have anything better that we could offer. We've spent a month working on this revised Module 5.1. So we're right now in the midterm. And what we really want to encourage everyone to do is deliver using revised Module 5.1. Today's webinar is meant to serve as a training event so that you'll understand how we intended Module 5.1 to be delivered. I do want to just point out that there are many right ways to do these things, and what we want to tell you is what our intent is, and we hope that what I show you today is one of the right ways to do this. A recorded demonstration will also be created to show a right way to deliver revised Module 5.1 to participants during an actual grower training course. In the long term, I referenced this a few minutes ago, pending funding, we want to create a version 2.0 of the grower training course, pending our ability to do that. So let's get into the Train the Trainer presentation. I'm going to pause here for just a second to make it easier to edit, because this is where we'll start doing the edited version and deliver a Train the Trainer update refresher, which we hope will take give or take a half an hour or 40 minutes, depending on how long I talk. The purpose of the Train the Trainer series that we created in 2020 was to review the critical concepts from each module and share recent FDA updates, PSA resources, tips for presenting. So this is a very timely thing for us to be going through now. Our intended audience is PSA trainers and lead trainers, but we acknowledge that a lot of people can benefit from having the exposure to this material and understand how to effectively promote the requirements in revised Subpart E. It's important to go through these disclaimers just so everyone knows now and in the recording that attending these office hours or watching their recordings does not count as attendance at a PSA Train the Trainer or Grower Training course. It does not make anyone's certificate eligible for the PSA AFDO certificates. And also just knowing that the PSA Grower Training slides are copyrighted. They're not to be published electronically without permission of Cornell University, not to be sold in whole or part for profit. So let's get into Module 5. I'm going to try to avoid referring too much to the old modules because this is moving forward, not looking back, but sometimes it's useful to know that things that changed and didn't change. One thing that didn't change is that we still have an introductory section. In that introductory section, slides 3 through 7 describe revised Subpart E and revised Module 5.1 a little bit. And then slides 8 through 14 talk about some general water quality standards for agricultural water, and they zero in on that definition of agricultural water. We really want to make it crystal clear what the definition of agricultural water is in the Produce Safety Rule. So we always talk about part 1 being production water, define production water, part 2 being post-harvest water, define post-harvest water. This first introductory slide, and in the bottom of the screen here, you can see that this is slide 3 of the revised Module 5.1. The main point of the slide is housekeeping. We're trying to clarify the difference between the printed PSA Grower Training Manual version 1.2 and this upcoming version that includes revised module 5.1. We're going to call that revised version 1.2/1.2a of the Grower Training Manual because the manual itself is identical to version 1.2 with the exception of revised module 5.1. This is where we explain also that there's been a shift from production water to the term pre-harvest water. When we created the PSA grower training curriculum starting back when, pre-2016, we used the term production water. In this new set of requirements that were in the revised Subpart E, FDA is using the term pre-harvest water, so we're generally adopting the term pre-harvest water as how we refer to what we used to call production water, but we still have to have some shout outs to production water because all of the other modules in version 1.2 still refer to production water. So although it's a little bit confusing to use two different terms, we do need to associate those two words together. In this module, we do tend to use the term pre-harvest water though, and that's why. Now we get to the numbering system. So in the slides from the Module 5, Part 1, provision numbers are used in the provision numbers in Module 5, Part 1 use the provision numbers of 2024. I mentioned a little bit earlier, 112.43 is now agricultural water assessment. Anyone who saw the original numbers in the original 2015 think that 112.43 means treatment. So we're taking great pains to ensure that a participant in a grower training course knows where to find the numbers. So the first thing to point out to them, or just to be clear, is that information about provision numbering is critical, and without the proper numbering, there can be confusion or ambiguity. So make it clear to participants that the numbers in revised module 5.1 refer to the 2024 numbering system. Everywhere else in the grower training manual, including 5.2 or module 5-2, we're referring to the original 2015 numbering system. Another thing is that especially for trainers, and sometimes for growers, if the trainer is training out of the version 1.2 manual, it's important to know what was in the original manual and what's in the revised handouts. So we did tag the slides that are the same as the original manual with the in this example we show module or version 1.2 of the manual, slide 4. We also need to talk about compliance dates because the revised Subpart E resulted in changes to compliance dates that are not reflected in the compliance date chart that's in Module 1. So in this case, the pre-harvest agricultural water compliance dates start in April of 2025, and they come in sequentially through 2027. We also went ahead and threw in the compliance dates for harvest and post-harvest water. Although those were already published, and those are the same as the ones that were in Module 1. You'll notice that in Module 1, it says January 22, 23, and 24. The subtle difference, or the real difference that's important, is that the compliance dates were 22, 23, and 24, but because of a policy of enforcement discretion, enforcement didn't begin until 23, 24, and 25. So that's why what we're in this slide, we're talking about enforcement dates of 23, 24, and 25, which come 1 year after the published compliance dates. This is where you shift to actually discuss the global requirements for production water. I'm sorry, for agricultural water. There are actually two global requirements. So keep in mind when you deliver Module 5.2 that this qualitative standard applies to both production water, pre-harvest water, and post-harvest water, but also the agricultural water systems inspection, which is described early on in revised Module 5.1, is relevant to both Module 5.1 and 5.2. So in this case, the global requirement that we all love to say is agricultural water must be safe and of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use. Something that's new is we used to have this as a supplemental slide that many of us used. Now we put it into the actual curriculum. The definitions are so important because if it's not used as agricultural water, the risks are managed by how the water is used, and it's not covered by the Produce Safety Rule Subpart E requirements. So in this slide, you can really point out, you can read the definition, you can do whatever you want to do to point out that agricultural water is intended to contact covered produce or food contact surfaces, and then also discuss what covered produce means. It's the harvestable, not the edible, but the harvestable or harvested part of the crop. To help you get that point across, we adopted some from a previous supplemental slide set, but we also created a few scenarios, resulting in 6 scenarios that apply the definition of ag water to make sure that some of the most important parts of the definition are always addressed in the PSA Grower Training Courses. This one is the softball. It's the introductory one, and it's used to emphasize that the definition of agricultural water has 3 parts: covered produce, covered activities, and contact. We threw in an example of pesticide application on apples to point out the fact that irrigation is not the only pre-harvest use of agricultural water. Depending on the audience, you might also decide to go into timing, because dormant applications that occur before blossom is not a use of agricultural water because the harvestable part of the apple crop is not present during the dormant season. This scenario with carrots and drip irrigation makes the point that it doesn't have to be overhead or foliar application to contact the harvestable crop and be agricultural water. The next one is to make the point about excluded produce, because potatoes are on the rarely consumed raw list. Even though it's overhead irrigation, it's not agricultural water. I think we're about to get to number 5, which is a new scenario that you may not have seen before. It brings in hydroponics. Hydroponics is really an emerging market and an emerging way of growing produce. We have a lot of hydroponic operations in our classes. So we wanted to talk in this case about head lettuce that's harvested with roots on. And in the notes, you'll see several discussion points that you can go into depending on the makeup of your participant group. The last one is avocado harvest and packing line sanitation. And the point of this scenario is to reiterate that it's contact with covered produce or food contact surfaces. In each one of the scenarios, notes are available that will help guide you through the key concepts and evaluate the sorts of things that you might want to say as part of the examples. Now we get to the revised Module 5, Part 1. This is an interim slide set. So remember, what we're doing here is to bridge the gap between publication of Subpart E back in May of 2024 and development version 2.0, which is going to take some time and resources. We want to assure you that we did our best, but in order to get the revised Module 5.1 done with a short turnaround time so that there's not a long gap without appropriate training materials, we were unable to go through the full process with focus groups and other feedback that other modules went through. This has been through FDA review, but it didn't go through the same extensive review that the PSA Grower Training Manual went through as it was developed back when Produce Safety Rule first came out. To be clear, the effective date for these requirements is in July 2024, and the first compliance dates arrive in 2025. That's short time period, so that's another reason why we wanted to do this on an accelerated schedule. This is a supplemental slide that I threw in simply to help you understand the structure of the module. We're up to slide 17 now, and I'm sorry, we will be in a couple of slides. And if you skip forward a little bit, we're going to talk about good agricultural practices and scientific principles first. So all these slides that are in the light green are similar to what you may have seen in previous versions of Module 5.1, and they cover the concepts. Then we have a short transition of 3 slides that talk about the agricultural water systems inspection and the agricultural water assessment and the interplay between those two. Then we have a long period of new slides. These are the light blue slides that discuss the agricultural water assessment elements, outcomes, and measures in response. That ends with some exemptions that are possible from the egg water assessment. And then in purple, we don't want to leave behind any of the information about testing, because testing, although it's not a requirement for pre-harvest water in most cases, it's still a requirement for 5.2 post-harvest water. And because these slides don't appear in module 5.2, we do really have to have them in module 5.1 so that a packer who attends the course still gets the information about testing. And testing is always going to be a useful tool and useful input to understanding water quality. And then we'll end with the conclusion slides, as we often do. So back to the revised module 5.1, we're on slide 16. This is an introductory slide that just talks about pre-harvest agricultural water requirements. This QR code and this URL take you to the FDA's website so that growers and other participants in the course can get to the actual language and the fact sheets that FDA revised. Remember that the revisions changed provision numbers, and some of the wording on sprout and post-harvest requirements are different, but the main effects were just on pre-harvest water requirements. Testing not being a requirement, the MWQP system, the microbial water quality profile system, can still be useful, but the grower also has the opportunity to choose paths that do not require testing. We'll talk about that more for those who've already been through training on the earlier versions of 5.1. This is a key change to make clear. In order to help participants access the codified language again and have access to what does 11243 say now, they can go to the website and the QR code. The last point on the slide is something to emphasize in each grower training course. There are a lot of, we'll call them uncertainties about how this is going to play out. The rule's only been out for a month. We're all trying to understand it. We can do our best, but we may not have all the answers. One key thing to encourage growers to do is to write down, to think through what decision points they made, know why they made those decisions, and be prepared to explain those decisions during an inspectional visit or during questions from someone else. We get to the learning objectives. These are unchanged. The concepts behind managing water quality have not really changed. It's the implementation that has. So we're going through the system that we go through in all of our modules. We're assessing what are the risks. We're implementing what are the practices, like water application method. How do these practices affect the environment, soil quality, and wildlife? We're monitoring. Can we do things like test the water in order to monitor and understand the quality of the water? Do we need to monitor the elements of the agricultural water assessment to see if something changed and a reassessment is required? Finally, we're taking actions in response that are called, in this case, measures. So what are those measures that can be taken if pre-harvest agricultural water risks are identified? And then the record keeping is always a key part of the delivery of any of our PSA modules. As you can see at the bottom left, these first slides have not changed. These are still from the version 1.2 manual. This one used to be slide 8. Now it's slide 18 because of the introductory material. But this slide is the introduction to revised module 5.1, the part on good agricultural practices and scientific principles. It kind of sets the stage for assessing risk. This is a good place to tie back to previous modules when you deliver, bringing up key concepts like we're focused on fecal oral pathogens. Farms rely on water to grow, harvest, and pack produce, so that water contacts a lot of produce, and that's a way of amplifying risk that we want to manage and control. We don't want those risks to produce safety amplified by using water that's not of appropriate quality. You can bring those topics up as you introduce the topic on this slide number 18. This is the slide where we discuss some of the ways that agricultural water is used pre-harvest. It's not just about irrigation uses. Sometimes we fall into the habit of saying irrigation water, irrigation water. You can walk through and describe why each one of these uses of water is pre-harvest agricultural water and how risk could be introduced into the produce growing area if the water is not of sufficient quality. This is the system that we like to use to discuss the three main elements. We talk always about the risk to produce safety depends on the water quality at the source and in the distribution system, the application method, does it or does it not contact the harvestable portion? We talked about that a lot in the definitions. And then the timing of application. Is it at planting or is it close to harvest? Each one of these, this is an introductory slide, so be sure you don't go into huge depth here because this is just meant to introduce those three concepts. As I walk through how to deliver these, keep in mind that the agricultural water assessment has two more elements that are not listed on this slide. One is crop characteristics, the other one is environmental conditions. So as we discuss how to introduce these concepts, I'll also tie those two elements into it. We start with a focus on water sources, describing in general the risk profiles for each type of water. These three types of waters are especially important because the agricultural water systems inspection and the agricultural water systems part of an agricultural water assessment requires that you understand the nature of the water source. And these three categories of water is one way to describe the nature of the water source. So it's going to come up again in the regulatory part of the module. So it's good to bring it up here. And in the notes, you'll see talking points for why surface water is described as a higher risk, public water supply is described as a lower risk. Then we get into some concepts, starting with public water supplies, that help us talk about potential sources of contamination while the water is under the control of the farm, in ways the farm can protect the system from contamination. Those concepts are really important to the agricultural water systems inspection and the agricultural water system that's part of the ag water assessment. In general, for water from a public water supply, the farm can assume that the source is acceptable because in the US anyway, it's covered by Safe Drinking Water Act, and in other countries, it's covered by other acts that manage drinking water quality. But the farm, although the water that is delivered to the curb may have acceptable water quality, the farm is responsible for maintaining the quality of water in the on-farm distribution system. And so here are some recommendations for public water supplies. Then you go into groundwater sources such as well water. The farm has control of both the well and the water distribution system in this case. So you can go through some practical things to look at, like the parts of the well that are above land surface that affect how effectively well water is protected. Consider doing some research online, take a course, talk to a colleague. If you're unable to describe things like, what's a sanitary seal look like? How do you know if it's in good shape? What about a backflow prevention device? How do I recognize that? How do I talk through with a grower, is my backflow prevention device actually working and accomplishing the goals? What kind of subsurface geology element can we talk about, like confining layers that are going to affect the vulnerability of this well water to contamination? If you can educate yourself on these topics, you can convey those important concepts to the growers, and those are valuable also in the regulatory part of the module. Slide 24 is an optional slide. We generally use this to describe all the sources of contamination that can affect surface water and really underscore the vulnerability of surface water. Explain why surface water was on the red high-risk side of that risk diagram that we showed a couple of slides ago. This can also be a useful slide to talk again about fecal oral pathogens, so the participants can focus their attention on, where's the poop coming from? How does poop get into my water? For purposes of Produce Safety Rule, just as a reminder, we're focused on biological hazards like pathogens, and most of the foodborne pathogens that are linked to fresh produce and other raw agricultural commodities are fecal oral pathogens. So it kind of helps narrow down the list of things to worry about, or prioritize the list of things to worry about, if you can remind people to pay most attention to fecal sources and pathways of fecal contamination. Then you get to what is sometimes a relatively difficult topic of how do you prevent contamination of surface water sources. We talk about kind of a sanitary survey, assessing nearby land uses, upstream water activities. This is also an opportunity to talk through the water distribution system in the same way that you talk through it with groundwater slides. When you're talking about protecting the water source itself, it can be useful to point out that realistically, protecting a surface water source can be difficult. Sometimes the surface water source isn't really under the farm's control, like for if it's a river or a stream that flows from off property onto a farm property. So one concept that might be useful when we get to the regulatory requirements is that although the farm doesn't always have the ability to protect quality of the water, especially upstream from the farm, they do have an obligation, and the agricultural water assessment helps them work through the system of understanding the quality of the water and making appropriate use decisions. Stop here, hesitate, be clear that this is a new topic. We're moving away from sources of the water in the distribution system, and we're talking about the agricultural water use practices, like how do you irrigate. As you go through some of the common irrigation methods, it can be useful to tie concepts related to crop characteristics into this discussion. So where the product grows on the plant can combine with how the water is applied, and together those factors, those elements affect whether or not the water contacts the harvestable part of the produce. As you go through that, how do you apply the water, lead up to the punchline, which is less contact with water is lower risk. We already talked about that a lot with the definition of agricultural water, and you can use this slide to really nail it and bring that concept home. The last of the practices and scientific concept slides describes the third major category of risk factors. Remember, we already went through the source, the application or use methods, and now we're talking about timing. On the application slide, you were able to bring in another concept that's useful. In the last slide, we talked about crop characteristics. In this slide, you can really talk a lot more about one of the other components of the agricultural water assessment, the environmental conditions. You can introduce this topic by talking about the FAT-TOM concepts from Module 1. We talked about the food, acidity, time, temperature, oxygen, and moisture as being components that allow a bacterial pathogen to grow or speed the die-off of bacterial pathogens. Those types of conditions can also affect the survivorship of viruses and protozoan or other parasitic pathogens. Those conditions that allow most human pathogens to survive or thrive can be related to the environmental conditions that affect survival. You could also talk about crop characteristics like surface roughness and internalization here in the context of pathogen survival. This slide marks the end of the conceptual slides. I should point out the big picture here is more time from application, more time between contact and consumption, generally speaking, is going to lead to more microbial die-off. With that concept, that end of the conceptual slides, you can stop to reinforce those three key categories. You could also take those, there are two optional slides. They're now numbered 54 and 55 that talk about the source, the application method, and the time. And those slides can be used here if you care to, in order to reinforce that these three things feed into your thinking about risk. They're also valuable where we put them at the end of the slides. This is your first big breakpoint. Up till now, the material was non-regulatory. It focused on concepts. Now you could consider reviewing those concepts again, linking the water so that you can link the agricultural water systems inspection with the quality of water sources and strategies that were brought up previously. In this slide, we would recommend talking about it being a requirement for both pre-harvest and post-harvest water. These are the first two bullets are good recommendations, and then the second two bullets are key must statements when you're delivering the slide. Because again, your patter, you've probably gotten into an educational patter, and now we're talking about regulatory concepts. This slide is one of the first ones in the revised Module 5.1 that is new. This one introduces the key requirements of an agricultural water assessment. I think it's important to know that the agricultural water assessment is described in 11243A. I don't think I'm going to read it to you. The notes are in Module 5, in this slide's notes, but it describes each one of these characteristics that's on the slide. that it must identify conditions, that it must be done at the beginning of the growing season, unless you have year-round growing seasons, but at least once annually, that it must be reassessed when there's a significant change, and then the record keeping written, reviewed, dated, signed in a reasonable time. So that just introduces the concept and lets people know what the key aspects of compliance will be, the things that we can check boxes and know. After you have gone through and talked about the agricultural water systems inspection and agricultural water assessment, you may find that people are confused about what's the difference between them. So this slide is an opportunity. Based on discussions up to now, we know that people are having trouble keeping clear what are the differences between those two things. They're different things. Each one requires a record. The systems inspection covers each ag water systems, both pre-harvest and post-harvest. The assessment only applies to pre-harvest, water used in growing produce that's not a sprout. That said, the results of the agricultural water systems inspection can be, and probably should be, part of the agricultural water assessment for those farms that have to do both. When we think about delivering this module, we start this one by saying, okay, what is the point of an agricultural water assessment? I look in the gray box and I say the agricultural water assessment will identify conditions that might introduce hazards into water. That's the first thing. And then importantly, determine whether measures are reasonably necessary to reduce that risk. So what are the sources of often fecal contamination and how do I disrupt it? It is a system that requires a lot of thinking. And for that reason, FDA has created the Agricultural Water Assessment Builder tool to help people think through the components that we're going to go through on the rest of this slide. So sometimes it can be helpful to let people know that resources are available to help them through it. We already talked about in the introduction, but let's go through them again. That there were 5 elements in the agricultural water assessment. The ag water system the ag water system characteristics, many of which were already written down in the ag water system inspection. Then we also have the agricultural water use practices, crop characteristics, environmental conditions, and other factors. This is an introductory slide. Use this to link with the agricultural water systems inspection and just to introduce the other 4 elements. In the notes of this slide number 33, we reference an FDA fact sheet that's the basis of this table that walks through each one of the 5 elements of an agricultural water assessment. And it talks about some characteristics that make the agricultural water, that system, more susceptible or less susceptible to contamination. So things like that we've already talked about. You can tie this back to those gaps or scientific concept slides that we talked about earlier. The nature of the water source. Surface waters are more susceptible. City water, muni water, drinking water, groundwater, less susceptible. The type of system. If it's an open system like a canal, the distribution system, it's going to be more vulnerable than a properly maintained closed piped system distributing the water throughout the farm. The degree of protection. Are animals and humans in the water, or are they prohibited from being in the water? You can walk through some of the concepts, some of the guardrails, some of the factors that would help a grower evaluate whether they actually do have conditions that could cause contamination to get into the water or be transported into the water. Agricultural water use practices, we talked about these also in those introductory slides. The application method, less contact is lower risk. The time interval, more time is lower risk. Then we talk about crop characteristics and environmental conditions. These are 2 areas that are new to many people's assessments of risk, but they are also concepts that we often tie into the introduction of hazards and the survivorship of hazards. So if a leaf surface has rough texture, if it's waxy, if it's fragile and vulnerable to damage, these are all things that can increase the risk compared to the opposite. waxy being something that reduces the risk, and a rough texture or something that's going to allow the pathogens to stick being something that increases the risk. So effective use of these two elements to make decisions is going to require the ability to integrate information into the holistic systems approach. It's a good idea for you, for all of us as trainers, to be up to date on research and principles that help participants do that integration. In the preamble, FDA mentioned several times that these requirements leave a lot of room for scientific advances. In other words, we may not have the answers today. So the answers to a lot of these questions have not been developed yet. We may all have to work together with growers, educators, and regulators to develop them over time. Don't be afraid to say, I don't know. And also recognize that if we don't have a firm answer we can give people, one of the mantras I think is going to come into play in this module is know what you did, why you did it, and be able to discuss it in a reasonable way during the inspectional visit if you have one. Finally, under other characteristics, test results are the one other characteristic that comes up in the preamble when we talk about other characteristics. This is the first time in revised Module 5.1 that we bring up the topic of testing. So remember from when we talked through the structure that a lot of information about how to do testing comes up later in the module. Here we're going to focus on why should you do the testing. When we are on slide 36, just talk about why. We'll talk about how later, and you can reassure people that we will be talking about how later. Even though test results don't serve as a sole basis for water use decisions, they can give useful insights to water quality. So in particular, if the assessment doesn't indicate conditions that could lead to contamination, but your test results say there's poop in the water, you probably missed something in the assessment. You can share that kind of information with the participants in your course. If the assessment shows that some conditions could lead to contamination, but you're not sure how vulnerable your system is to those conditions, low test results can be a source of reassurance and a source for making a decision that maybe your conditions are being managed. One of the tricky things to navigate, especially for people who are familiar with the MWQP system, is that in the preamble's comments that are in the notes, the MWQP, the Microbial Water Quality Profile System, could be used as an input to the agricultural water assessment under those specific conditions that we talked about, which we're going to talk about again in the next slide. It's important not to focus exclusively or strongly on the MWQP for two reasons. One is it's not described in revised Module 5.1, so you're only going to be talking to the ones in the classroom who already know about the system. And second, it's not the only system of water testing that can be used. Let's get to this chart. This table is based on an FDA fact sheet. We made a few changes that we feel like will make it a little bit easier for some people to understand. On this chart, what we want you to do is go through the determinations, which is the colored boxes, and use those to talk about the outcomes, which are the open boxes. And some people will say you don't consume an elephant in one bite. We're going to try to consume this elephant of agricultural water assessment outcomes and determinations one piece at a time. In this slide, we're focusing on the determinations, the categories of determinations, and the categories of measures. You can reinforce the timing of the measures. If ag water is not safe or of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use, immediately discontinue use and take some corrective actions before you use that water, and so on down through this chart. Remembering that this is the one place testing water comes up in a regulatory setting, remembering that corrective measures and mitigation measures are two terms that are going to be important to know, but don't get into it in too much depth because in the very next slide, we're going to talk about corrective measures and mitigation measures. Notice that the two corrective measures that appear in the list are also in the list of mitigation measures. So we're going to talk about them together in the following slides. Reinspection followed by repairs and treating according to the FSMA Produce Safety Rule. Those can be used in either one of these categories of outcomes. We'll just talk about them once as we go through the materials though. Linking back to that previous slide, if water is not safe and of adequate sanitary quality for its intended pre-harvest use, then only these two corrective measures can be used. Those of you who harken back to the old system, notice microbial die-off is not one of the corrective measures. Be sure to mention that changing the water and taking alternative mitigation measures are other mitigation measures that are on this slide. Where are they? Here's one of them, taking alternative mitigation measures, and the other one is changing the water application method. Those only appear on this slide. If you change the water application method enough, you're not using it within the definition of agricultural water. So that's one reason to bring that one up. And then taking alternative mitigation measures is another option. Going through our measures, reinspection can be either a corrective or a mitigation measure, keeping in mind the state and local requirements. Treating agricultural water is a topic that's going to be brought up in more depth in Module 5.2. In the short term, it can be challenging to find a chemical treatment method that's labeled for use treating irrigation water to control public health microorganisms. So a chemical treatment that's labeled for the use will have an efficacy statement, something like if it's used as directed, it will reduce 99.9% of target organisms like E. coli 0157 and Salmonella. Since most of the information about EPA labels is presented in Module 5.2, focus your delivery on what the EPA labeled, focus your delivery on the material in the slides, and know that 5.2 is going to talk about those labels. Die-off and removal can be a little complicated. Remember, it's only a mitigation measure, not a corrective measure, and it's going to be able to be used in both a qualitative or a quantitative. What I mean by that is, if in some instances, a grower would be able to assume 0.5 logs per day die-off of pathogenic microorganisms in the field. In order to use that information, you would have to have both a starting concentration and a target concentration so that you could calculate 0.5 logs per day, how many days do I need? Instead of a quantitative way of doing it, because if you don't have all that information, you could use it qualitatively. I think that 5 days is long enough to reduce the risk that I observed in my agricultural water assessment. We currently don't have much guidance on how to effectively apply and explain why a particular number of days is considered long enough. So that's another area where there is room for future scientific data to better explain that system. Reassessments are going to be done each year, and anytime there's a significant change in the system, so you want to talk through that reassessment. The agricultural water assessment is not necessarily a one and done. There is going to be a requirement or a need to continually reevaluate those elements to see whether something changed significantly and whether a reassessment is necessary. Thank you, Michelle Danilick. I just saw your note in the chat. When we get in, and I'll just share for the recording that for many of these characteristics, we may be lacking the scientific data to come up with effective answers. And we just acknowledge that. And we are all going to have to work together to do what we can to give reasonable, accurate, and actionable answers when we get questions. This is the slide where we're going to talk about pooling, flooding, and adulteration. It's very similar to a slide that was in version 1.2. The things that we want to focus on this slide is that a lot can happen during the growing season. Not all of it's covered as part of an agricultural water assessment, so we can acknowledge those other situations here. But in particular, two regulatory things are the requirement to minimize risk caused by pooling water in the growing area, and the fact that produce contacted by natural floodwaters can be considered adulterated under FD&C with restrictions on how that contacted crop may be used. Generally speaking, flooded crops cannot be sold for use as food. There are three specific examples of exemptions to the agricultural water assessment. Each one of those is generally related to whether the grower knows the water is equivalent to drinking water quality from a microbiological standpoint, and also has the documentation to support the feeling that the water is equivalent to drinking water quality, and that the quality of the water will not change prior to use. This is the second big transition point. We went through concepts, then we went through the agricultural water systems inspection and assessment. Now we get back into the slides that cover testing. For veteran trainers, you will have covered this in previous versions, but now we may have a slightly different twist to it. In this slide, you're talking about testing as a valuable information source of valuable information under any circumstances, under regulatory conditions, only under specific circumstances is testing part of an agricultural water assessment. This slide helps participants understand what generic E. coli means in the context of the other indicators and fecal oral pathogens. Keep in mind that other scientifically valid indicators also can be used. When we get to this slide, we're talking about how to help a grower know when and where to collect a sample that's going to give them useful information. This information is useful in both Module 5.1 and 5.2 because any sample that's collected needs to be collected right. It has to use aseptic technique. The notes of this slide and some of the content of the slides helps a grower understand what is aseptic technique. In other words, clean containers, avoid contaminating or adding E. coli other than what was in the water to that bottle. The grower in the revised Subpart E is still given a lot of flexibility for how the analysis is done as long as the analyst is competent. Doesn't have to be a certified laboratory. The slide and the notes give practical recommendations about sample analysis, hold time, chilling the sample on the way to the lab. We also added the laboratories map that's hosted by NECAS Food Safety Resources Clearinghouse, which can be really useful for growers who are looking for a laboratory, especially if they're analyzing for generic E. coli. We're going into a series of optional slides that can be useful in a lot of situations. For each one of these, I just want to point out when you would choose to use this optional slide. If a grower opts to do testing of pre-harvest water, using a method other than EPA method 1603, they're required to have documentation that that water is equivalent to method 1603. FDA put out a handy-dandy fact sheet that states that these methods that are listed on the sheet are equivalent, and so that can be a useful part of documentation. Similarly, for presence-absence methods, which are used in post-harvest, keep in mind that this slide is not in Module 5.2, but presence-absence tests for generic E. coli is required to be done for post-harvest water. So this can be an important slide to show in Module 5.1 because it's going to be important to slide 5.2, and it doesn't appear in Module 5.2. Another optional slide, but a concept that's useful, is reviewing test results so that the grower can spot trends in water quality data early and address any issues that have changed before those issues cause produce safety risk. This is a graphic illustration, another optional slide of you've gone through and you've been sampling and you've been getting numbers that are in the low 50, less than 100, and then suddenly you get a large number. This is an opportunity to say something happened and I want to investigate what happened. So you can point that out to the growers using this slide. These are the two risk slides that I mentioned earlier. You're evaluating risk having to do with the water source, application method, and application timing, and discussing with the growers, how does that all tie together into risk? Now we're also including characteristics of the crop and environmental conditions into that thinking. This is the second example. The module ends with record keeping. It's important to the compliance and effective implementation in all the modules. In revised Module 5.1, specific records that are required depend on what path the grower takes as they navigate the agricultural water systems inspection, the ag water assessment, and measures that are applied to manage the water quality and risk to produce. Records of the inspection and assessment are always required unless the grower is eligible for an exemption. Use this slide and the next one to share specific conditions when particular records are required. For instance, when a farm chooses to test the water as part of their assessment, they would consider or maybe need to have these records depending on the choices they make. Similarly, if a farm is exempt from an agricultural water assessment, because they're using public water supply water, they would have to document that public water supply characteristics or testing with a certificate of compliance or some other way in order to support their eligibility for exemption. Farms that implement measures as one of the outcomes of their ag water assessment would also have a pick list of things that they are required to document depending on which measures they implement. When we summarize, it's useful to use that summary slide to reinforce concepts that were presented, help the participants realize how regulatory requirements can be used to effectively manage risk, protect produce safety, and manage conditions that affect water quality. In other words, enable people to make water use decisions in the context of the conditions that they identify in an agricultural water assessment. FDA has a web page. Again, there's the direct link to it in this QR code. And the fact sheets that were provided for the proposed ag water Subpart E are now finalized and updated to reflect the final versions of that language. Yeah, so 40 minutes was a pipe dream. I apologize. I took a bit longer. I hope it was worth some of the time that we took to go through that. We're going to take a moment and discuss if anything's unclear about the content of this new slide set, and then we'll talk about some of the policies and expectations. Can somebody help me out, because I have not been able to keep up with the chat?
Hi, Don.
Yes, thanks, Betsy.
I have been answering questions that I have been triaging and just trying to get them out because there's a lot there. And the ones I felt like I could type while I'm answering my phone in the chat box. So I can start off with Karen's question, which is in the Q&A. And her question is, from the perspective of municipal water quality, how does a farmer address things like boil orders? So these are these unusual circumstances that I think would fall under the not safe or of adequate sanitary quality time frame. But you want to go ahead and answer that? Well, okay, I'll answer it. The deal is if it's under boil water and it is not safe or not of adequate sanitary quality, and you are using that in a post-harvest way, or even in a pre-harvest way as ag water, you are going to have to discontinue use immediately, would be how I would read that, because that, by virtue of a boil order, it is not safe and of adequate sanitary quality. If you knew more about it, if the boil order actually told you more specifics, you might be able to say, okay, I can use it for pre-harvest if you go ahead and make that assessment that it isn't a risk, then I think you would do that. But for boil orders are weird things depending on how they come across.
Right. And the reason I paused was, I always rely on the preamble to share FDA's current thinking. I was trying to phrase the response in the preamble in which effectively the guidance that was provided is it's up to the grower to know whether or not that boil water order exists and what it means to the quality of the water.
Right. And that's that second part. If you know it exists, right, you have that. She gave us that information. The question is, what do you know about that boil order? Exactly. Right. That's
and
what
Michelle Danlick just threw in the chat part of, reinforcing that recommendation from one of the slides, have a backup plan. If you know that you get boil water orders sometimes, well, have a backup plan so you're not caught without water when you need your water. I can't answer Karen's follow-up question about do they have to test to prove it's safe again without guidance from FDA. Is it a good idea to test that it's safe again? Yes. I hesitate to say they must without actual guidance from FDA. I don't want to characterize what an inspector would want without that guidance from FDA.
Okay, so we had a question about slide 36 that Michelle will look at that. Michelle Smith, in terms of should it be R to can be and maybe. I can't say that because I don't think we should troubleshoot that right now. We can look. Also a question in the Q&A. I still have questions on how much mitigation is enough to say it is safe. You want to try that one?
I'm trying to be really nice. And it's hard for a boy like me to be nice. I think that I think that the recommendation that you have been sharing recently, Betsy, is worth repeating. Know what you did, why you did it, and be able to have a civilized, data-based conversation about it so that you can try to convince yourself, know that you believe that it's enough, and also convince the person who's evaluating it that you were right in making cautious decisions.
That is exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah, our end goal is protecting the consumer. We also have to maintain farm viability, economic and otherwise. So we all have to make that balance.
Mm-hmm. Corrective measures imply prevention of reoccurrence, question mark.
I would have to look. I don't remember seeing anything. If you apply a corrective measure, you have to confirm that you have resulted in water that is now safe and of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use. I think that it's a good idea to make sure you don't find yourself in the same situation again. I think that's good practical advice. In a regulatory sense, I don't know that there was ever any linkage to making sure it doesn't reoccur. But it's certainly good practical advice.
Mm-hmm. What is an acceptable level of generic E. coli in pre-harvest water?
I'll share with you that FDA in the preamble, and I can come up with the comments as needed, stands behind that the best available science supports the idea that 126 geometric mean and 410 statistical threshold value are useful benchmarks for when is the water safe. When is the level of risk? I don't want to venture into territory of safe and adequate. It's different from safe and adequate, but that these numbers indicate water that may be appropriate for the use.
Good. Yep, that's exactly where I was going to go with that. This is like a quiz between us if we agree or disagree.
Yeah, exactly. It's the dating game, as it were.
Yeah, Mike mentioned we're still subject to an auditor's judgment. Absolutely.
100%.
One of the discussions that I just put in the chat box, if you guys read it, was talking about when is testing required. And I wrote a whole thing, and the very last sentence of that was, remember, many growers are still testing their water to meet audit requirements and buyer requirements. So don't be telling growers they don't need to test their water if they have to do that for a buyer requirement. Even if they're not required to test their water for the PSR, they may be required to test their water for buyer requirements. And let us not forget, growers need to stay in the marketplace.
Right.
So
I spotted a question from Norm a few minutes ago that how long does it take to deliver this? I did a practice delivery, and Norm, I'm not the fastest person to light. And it took me 50 minutes, 50, to deliver this module when I did a practice session.
Yeah, that was another discussion I was having. I think what's going to be really important for this delivery is get the information to them. Like Don said, try and get it in the 50-minute mark and leave that time for answering questions, right? Help them walk through, give them a chance to test out their thinking. So that's a key thing. Okay, I'm going to switch to a chat box here. There was a discussion about the 0.5 log die-off per day changing, and I said we would look at that to make sure it's in the notes. I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
So FDA does defend does say that 0.5 logs per day can be used if the conditions on your farm and your commodity are similar to the conditions such that it's appropriate, the conditions that the 9 studies that led to that 0.5 assumption came from in the first place. You can also use and defend any other die-off rates if you can defend it and know that it is an effective way to manage risks on your farm.
Don, somebody wants you to pop back one slide so that they can get the QR code.
Oh, I thought I did that already for Karen. I'll do it again though.
Okay. You answered Norm's question.
Yeah.
We answered that. I plan to use it for those who get.
I'm going to go ahead and jump to Annalisa's while you're reading.
Please do.
Annalisa asked for triggers that a grower should take a corrective measure versus a mitigation measure. Those corrective measures are going to be taken when there's an immediate threat, when the water is not safe and of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use. And there were three examples that were given. One is if there's a dead animal rotting and decaying. A second one is if there's a amount of human fecal material, like in a combined sewer overflow. I'm making this, the preamble states some of the conditions. I'm giving you some examples from experience. A herd of dead and decaying sheep in a canal or deer in a river, something like a combined or a sanitary sewer overflow that pours human waste that's improperly treated into the waterway would render it not safe and of adequate sanitary quality, or if something like an animal waste holding lagoon fails following a rainfall or for any other reason and dumps animal waste, a significant amount of animal waste into the waterway. Those are the three conditions that were considered for sure not safe and of adequate sanitary quality that would trigger a corrective measure. But FDA was also clear in the preamble in saying that not all cases will be that clear cut. So those are the examples I can share.
Do you want to give one for mitigation before I steal and make you move along, and you can do the answering in the typing box?
Sure. Yeah. No, I feel like mitigation measures are things like if you know that you have a flock of birds, migratory geese that have stopped off and spent time in your pond, or that they will stop off and spend time in your pond, you can be fairly sure they're going to poop in that pond, and that might be a condition where it's only a mitigation measure as opposed to a corrective measure.
Okay. Or conditions that aren't related to animals.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
So I'm gonna pop on, and then I want to get through the remaining slides, and then whatever time we have left, we will commit to a discussion.
Great.
And
Thank
you can start taking a swat at some of the Q&A answers.
I appreciate you.
Okay. Okay. So we're moving to policies and expectations. First of all, Don did a great job. I think we all acknowledge that. Good job. He went a little bit longer, but that's okay. We're going to get through the rest of these. So expectations for PSA trainers, and there's some questions in the chat box about this. So we are going to ask people to use the revised module 5.1 slides for all grower trainings moving forward. When are you going to see them? As soon as humanly possible. We are trying to reconcile the English and the Spanish translation and get them laid out. We know from team meeting this morning, Rob is really close with the English, but we need to get the resolution with the Spanish. We will use those PSA resources to guide your delivery and ensure the participants have a printed copy for the references and for note-taking. Again, I'm going to cover in a second how you're going to get those. Be clear that all prior versions, are different from the current regulatory requirements. And this is relevant for people that have version 1.1 or version 1.2 manuals. That 5.1 that is there, especially that MWQP section, is no longer really relevant to what we're trying to convey to folks. Next slide. Sorry, Don. If you're using that V1.2, we strongly recommend that you give, if you're not going to use these revised 5.1 and you're going to use the old 5.1, we recommend you use those supplemental slides that are available on our website, again, because they will allow you to capture the proposed changes. Those were built around the proposed. They're mostly correct, right? So we don't want you using the old 5.1 slides without adding those proposed or supplemental slides. It is not acceptable. We had a big discussion about how to say this. Do not keep using 5.1 as is without telling people the new rule has changed those requirements. This is really to the lead trainers out there. You're the folks that are the gatekeepers of policy. So please make sure if you are the lead trainer and someone else is delivering 5.1, that they have the appropriate slides, that they're using the appropriate approach to these slides. Next slide. Printed copies. What's going to happen is, as soon as we get them laid out, we are going to post a printable PDF of those revised module 5.1. We're calling it V1.2A just for module 5.1. We will get those to all the trainers. You will get an email with that link. You will make sure you have access to it. We will also post a new interactive PDF as soon as we can get to it. Here's a question, and you can just put a yes or a no in the chat box, which is going to make all those answers go up. But is there a need for us to commercially print handouts for sale through the bookstore of just revised 5.1? Okay, fantastic. I see a lot of no's. That's fantastic. Okay, so here's the other thing we are looking at doing. Once the current stock of manuals is exhausted, we are going to print a V1.2, 1.2a that swaps out just 5.1. Okay, it's not a perfect solution. It is not a V2, but that is what we're going to do to try and make life easier on all of us. Okay, next slide. So what's the timeline? We're working as hard as we can to get this done. Again, both in English and in Spanish. Getting those notes formatted, that requires Rob to do that layout and get them off so that you have access to them. There will be associated materials. There will be an English-Spanish TTT tutorial. It may be drawn from today. There will also be an English-Spanish GT tutorial. So somebody from the team will deliver this just as we would do to growers. Today was train the trainer, much more high level. This one, we will give you slide by slide of how we would present it to a grower. It's not the way you have to do it. It's a way of how to do it and to try and get it into that time frame we were talking about. Next slide. Trainers will be sent this email message. I already mentioned this. The files will be under the PSA website under the Trainer Resources Module 5. There will be a download button. Why are we going to do this? You're going to have to verify your status as a trainer, and we're going to have to share information. The reason is so that if anything changes, we know who's downloaded those slides so we can get back to you and tell you that it's changed. As is probably, hopefully already obvious, we are scrambling to get things done as soon as possible, but we want to stick to our expectations for accuracy and quality. So we are double checking as we go. Again, as they translated into Spanish, it brought up some questions in terms of word choice. So those are all things that we're doing, and we appreciate your patience. Next slide. We do want to have a discussion with you all. I know we're tight on time. We do have some poll questions that I believe are next up. Yes, so here we go. Don, do you have control of the poll?
I do, but I've never actually done a poll, so I have to figure out how to do it.
Okay. Okay. Well, so I guess you can also raise your hand and unmute yourselves, but
I think I succeeded.
Okay.
If somebody can confirm that in the chat, I'd appreciate it.
Oh, there it is. Yes, there's a poll. So if you all could answer these poll questions, does the revised Module 5.1 approach allow you to confidently continue to do the PSA grower trainings? Yes, no, or an open field? One of the questions we've talked about internally, okay, doing this slide set, we had a lot more slides and we gutted a bunch of slides to make sure we had time for discussion. So the question was, do you want an additional educator call to talk about resources, to talk about delivery, to talk about all these other slides that we cut out of this slide set to give us more time? So that's another question. That's 2. And then 3 is, what else do you need from us that we can work on? While you guys are filling that out, I'm going to look. Michelle asked, can we call it 1.3? No, we don't want to call it 1.3 because we're only changing Module 5.1. We had a lot of discussions about what to call this, and it's really only Module 5.1 that is changing. So that's what we're doing. Depends on when the new manuals are available. I'm not sure, Heather, if
I think Heather was answering, do we need the standalone for purchase revised?
Oh, I see. I see.
And she said, I don't know. It depends on when I can get it as part of the manual.
Okay. Okay. That sounds good.
While I'm talking, I do want to deeply apologize for taking more time. Edna mentioned in the chat, when are we going to get to the Q&A? And I know, Edna, you have an upcoming course, and I think that many of us at PSA would be happy to talk to you about any questions you have, because we know this is important to you as you deliver that course.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Betsy.
No, we're working very hard to get the handouts out as well as the slides out. So if we can get them out this week, we will. And you will be the first ones to know. As soon as they're up, everybody will get an email.
I will point out that there's a glutton for punishment there. We are all as a group of gluttons for punishment because people are answering number two as a series of calls would be nice.
Okay. All right. Okay, it looks
You want me to
like,
move on to the next slide while people are continuing with?
yes, let's do that. Let's do that. But I really think this is sort of, we might want to close the poll and talk about the poll, because what we're looking at now, open mic, if you guys want to unmute, is sorry, Don, you just messed me up there.
Go ahead.
Is what are your overall thoughts about presenting the requirements in Subpart E as part of your grower training? We've already seen in the chat box, people are worried about how long it will take. We do know that is a concern, but I think the things that are imperative, one, if you're going to deliver 5-1, brush up on what the science is behind some of those areas. As somebody already mentioned, there isn't a ton of science on a multitude of crops in terms of crop characteristics, right? We have some publications, but they're usually on limited amounts of commodities. So it'd be wise to brush up on that. And I think this is something Don and I talked about covering in another educator's call, is to talk about where is the science with some of this to help guide growers as they go through. Most importantly, I'll say this and then I'll turn it over to somebody else. Most importantly, when you are working with growers and they are starting to do the agricultural water assessment, really stress to them that they need to know why they're making the decision they're making. There is going to be a lot of learning over the next time. We don't have all the guidance we need. We don't have all the science we need. The best thing we can help growers do is guide them through the process and help them understand, or help work with them so they understand why they make the decision they're making. Because that's where we're at this juncture. So I'll stop there.
Betsy, just because we have several people who are asking and we're close to the end, I want to bounce off. Many people in the attendance are giving a course in the next several days or a couple of weeks. And we don't want anybody to freak out. So correct me if I'm wrong in saying this. If we do not have these slides available to you today, you don't really have a choice. We don't have any choice but to do the best we can, which is 5.1 version 1.2 plus the supplemental slides. As soon as we can, we'll make revised module 5.1 available to you with all resources. And as soon as you can, provide it to the growers, because that's the best way to do it. But we also recognize that doing the best you can is the best you can do.
That's correct. That's correct. And
Great.
that's why the supplemental slides are there. And again, we'll get these out to you just as soon as we can. We debated, okay, so we had a lot of internal talk about not doing this until everything was ready, but we're trying to keep this moving forward. And so trying to get time on the calendar was difficult for the team. So again, we appreciate your patience. Somebody mentioned about the preamble being really long. The preamble will answer some of your questions and we'll give you, but again, it takes that investment of reading it, as Don has committed many of those comments to memory already.
Can I Cesar and Maria both have their hands up, and I wonder if we could open the mic to
we
them.
can definitely do that.
Okay, Cesar, you should be you have the ability to unmute.
By the way, he's had his hand up the whole time.
Oh, has he? Okay.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Did you have a question, Cesar, that you wanted to bring up?
No.
Okay.
For some reason, that hand is like that from the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah, my mouth does the same thing as your hand. Sometimes it's just hard to control. I'm going to go to Maria.
I think she might have put her hand down.
Okay, great. And
Okay.
so then I guess from the bottom, do you want to go with Chip? Will FDA issue guidance document for this provision? I do think that they will. Do I have any idea on a timeline? No. Your turn, Betsy.
There's a good one, Don, that I know. Our municipal water authority is only listing total coliforms, not generic E. coli.
Oh my
Does
God.
municipal water need tested if the agency doesn't provide seemingly adequate information? This is one that has eaten up a lot of PSA discussion time.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to be careful and say that I'm not giving a regulatory response and I'm not speaking for an inspector. If the agency issues total coliform results, they did not do a follow-up analysis for E. coli because if there are no total coliforms, there should be no E. coli. So if they're only reporting total coliforms and it's no detect, well, that should be enough. If they report total coliforms are detected and they don't give answers as to whether the E. coli in follow-up were detected, which I've never seen before, that would be a problem. The one thing to point out is that the microbial equivalent of drinking water, the only maximum contaminant level in Safe Drinking Water Act drinking water requirements is E. coli. Total coliforms is a trigger for retesting and enhanced monitoring, but total coliforms is not an MCL, not a maximum contaminant level for drinking water, as I understand the Safe Drinking Water Act and EPA's requirements. Does that answer the question? Betsy, do you think that answered the question?
I think that answers the question.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was typing another answer to another question, trying to do double duty while you were handling that one.
Yeah, well, I was flapping jaws.
Yeah, so no, I think that's good. And we're working on, there's a document we're working on related to this that it's almost done. It's in the file.
It could be, yeah.
Yeah, it's in the pile. Okay. We are about a minute away. We can stay on. I don't want to hold people. Chana has her hand up. Let's unmute her.
Actually, Betsy, could you, I'm going to, while Chana is thinking about her question, Dahlia asks, if someone's already taken the course, already meets requirements for 11222C, do they have to retake the course? And the answer is, as I understand it, they do not have to retake the PSA Grower Training Course. It's a very good idea.
I already put this in the chat box, in the Q&A. This was already answered earlier.
Great.
Sorry. Chana, I think here, I'm allowing you to talk, but you keep disappearing on me. Okay, there you go.
I'm here.
Okay.
Are you, or what's the intention about talking about or not talking about the FDA tool or the ability for industry or growers to use a different platform to conduct their agriculture water assessment?
Okay, so we consciously made a decision to not talk about that today because we had so much content we were trying to pile drive through. That would fall into an area where I think that would be great for a follow-up call and to talk about that because the tool is not a requirement.
Right.
The tool is a tool. So if other tools are available, they absolutely could use another tool.
And I'm just trying to get at that if FDA is going to use the tool as their guide because we might think that they would do that, right? It might be in a grower's best interest to also have those same questions answered, even though we think it's great or not great, I guess. Just wanted feedback on that.
And again, so we actually had a question about the tool that I made Don take out because I was like, we're not going to have time with that. I think this is something that if people are interested in another thing, we should talk about this. We should have a discussion about it specifically. Pros, cons, and value.
Yeah. And then, my next question was what kind of, and maybe we can't say anything, but what kind of discussion will we have with folks about disagreements and interpretation? Because a lot of this is so subjective. And, how are we empowering growers, right? I guess other than doing what you say you're going to do and why, and justify that, what kind of guidance we're giving them.
Yeah, so again, we have that little cheat sheet for trainers that's like, here's what you cover in all the modules, right? We've been updating that this weekend. In fact, we were working on it. And one of the things we talk about is when growers are making decisions and you're helping them and it's based on research, I always give growers a copy of the research, highlight the parts that are relevant, tell them to keep that kind of information with them, because we do know it is subjective, absolutely, and we want it to be as based on science as we can, which goes back to the comment about there isn't a lot of science on some of these things. So again, this is another thing that was on our list to talk about in another call. It's amazing how quickly an hour and a half flows by, but very, very important. Go ahead.
I'm going to share the poll just so that people get there.
Please do.
And I can't actually see it. So are you seeing it?
Stop
Yes,
share.
I can see it.
Okay, great.
Okay. While you're doing, are you reading? Okay, these are just the results, right?
Yeah, these are just the results.
Okay.
I mean, 85 people gave us written answers, which is really nice. Thank you.
Okay, that's fantastic. So 83% feel confident. We'll look at those results. 31% say yes, but not now. 16% say as soon as possible. So we've got some breathing room there. Preferably a series of calls is 35%. Nope, we got it is 25%. My head is spinning. That's a 4%. And there are other materials where you got answers, right? So we'll go through there. I saw a message from Karen Cox about changing subjects about PSA funding. I feel like I need to address that one. Currently, PSA has an extension on our current cooperative agreement that we think will get us into July and August, hopefully squeaking us into September. We have applied for another cooperative agreement. We are hopeful that is under the review process. We're hopeful we'll get something. In what was offered initially, it would not support the whole team. And as you know, we've been losing people. If you look at our list right now, we've lost Collins Bujingo, and Davis is now the Western Regional. So we've lost 2 people in both the Northwest and the Southwest, and we're now moving an SLEA focus over to the Western region. So that's what we know. If you have conversations with Congress people or with people of power, please let them know where we're at, because we could use the funding. I think there's a lot of work that needs done.
So Callahan asked a question that I think would be interesting to talk about, which is how closely is our revised Module 5.1 aligned with how the inspectors are being trained?
Ooh, I don't have the slightest clue.
Exactly. I thought it was worth saying that live.
No, I don't have any idea what they're being told. As you know, traditionally, we've been prohibited from attending their training. So that's where we're at with that. Okay, we have to close this down. There's still a lot of questions. We will try to grab some of these questions and in a follow-up email to trainers, maybe try to cover some of them. Is that fine? Is that a fine way to proceed? Okay. Thank you. I hope we have answered a lot of your questions. And it looks like you guys would like more of these calls, so we'll see what we can do. Funding needs to happen. So thank you. Thank you, Don. Great job. Thanks for taking the lead on it. And thanks to the PSA team for the backup of the presentation today.
And everyone, I mean, the team effort on this one, 100%. So much translation, fact checking, discussion that went into this. So
absolutely. Shout out to the PSA team that always works late and weekends and all the other stuff. Thank you all. Thank you all for your time. A lot of investment of your time, most valuable thing you can give us. Thank you, and have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.